With the Aobas and Miyokos under construction and the Furutakas and Yubari complete in April of 1927, Japan started construction of the 4 ships of the 11,400-ton Atago class. These ships were improved Miyokos. It would be easy to simply look at their continued use of 5 twin turrets and call them redos, but that's because their similarities were more obvious than their differences. Upon closer inspection, they had some big differences when completed. One example was the torpedo tubes. They still used the Type 90 24-inch torpedo, but whereas the Miyokos originally had 12 tubes built into the hull, the Atagos used torpedo mounts. These were actually fitted to the main deck, but holes in the superstructure which covered them allowed the mounts to rotate outward to be fired. Since the number of tubes actually dropped compared to the previous class, and even at this point, torpedoes were seen as such important weapons, these new mounts carried reloads for their tubes. As a result, the actual number carried rose. Another change was whereas the Miyokos only had 1 catapult mounted on the center line, the Atagos carried 2 catapults, 1 on each side of the aircraft handling or flight deck. This underscored the growing theory of float planes for fleet reconnaissance, sub-hunting, and spotting of shells in a battle. It was an idea that would eventually lead to the Tone and Oyoto classes and still survives to this day in the form of shipborne helicopters. Another change was to the main guns. While the same number and layout was retained, the guns were the new 203mm 50 caliber. These were based on the older 200mm 50 caliber gun. Interestingly, the intention was to be able to use them in the barrage anti-aircraft role. As such, on all but Maya, they had a maximum elevation of 70 degrees. This explains their decrease in secondary guns. Of course, given the training and elevation speed and rate of fire, this was a laughable idea, even in the late 20s. Anyway, these guns were used to rearm all the other heavy cruisers. Oddly enough, the turret specifications on the rearmed ships varied, most notably in elevation, which led to varying maximum ranges. On the very downside, these ships had problems. Most notably, they used the same construction principles pioneered on Yubari. As such, while designed for 10,000 tons, they came out at 11,400. Even more overweight than the Miyokos. This was despite the introduction of welding to save the weight of rivets. As a result, like previous ships, they were top-heavy, slower than projected, and structurally weak. It didn't help that the science of welding was very new to them, and the work proved shoddy. As a result, like many ships, all had to go in for major work after the Tomozuru and 4th Fleet incidents. The strain on the Japanese economy again showed in their construction. Only 2 could be authorized per year. Even then, the shipyard building Maya went bankrupt and had to be bailed out. As a result, she was started much later than her sister. This did mean she could have her main guns modified to drop the useless high-angle elevation. In the run-up to the war, and early on, the strain on the Japanese economy, industry, and shipyards showed up again. Atago and Takeo were given moderate upgrades, but Maya and Chokai were only given minimal work. Work on the others had to be planned out, but the materials, money, and shipyards simply weren't available. As a result, they were effectively divided into 2 subclasses. Maya did get work done to her in early 1944, but a similar plan for Chokai was never carried out. Atago was started April 28, 1927, and completed March 30, 1932. Takeo was started April 28, 1927, and completed May 31, 1932. Chokai was started March 28, 1928, and completed June 30, 1932. Maya was started December 28, 1928, and completed June 30, 1932. Main armament was 10 203mm 50 caliber guns in 5 twin turrets, 3 forward and 2 aft. The 203mm 50 caliber twin mount weighed about 170 metric tons. Maximum elevation on the first three Atagos was 70 degrees. Maximum elevation on the Furutakas, Aobas, Mogamis, Tones, and Maya was 55 degrees, but of course anything over 45 is useless. At 45 degrees, they had a maximum range of 29,400 meters. The Miyokos had a maximum elevation of only 40 degrees, which gave them a maximum range of 28,900 meters. Rate of fire was realistically 3 rounds per minute per gun. The barrels were individually sleeved, meaning they could raise and lower separately in a mount. Training speed was 4 degrees per second, and elevation speed was 6 degrees per second. Loading was at 5 degrees. The projectiles were 125.85 kilograms with a 8.2 kilogram bursting charge. They used 2 powder bags. Secondary armament was 4 120mm 45 caliber dual-purpose guns in single open mounts. 1 mount on each side of the forward funnel and 1 mount on each side of the rear funnel. Torpedo armament was 4 trainable twin mounts fitted to the upper deck but covered by the superstructure for the Type 90 24-inch torpedo. 1 pair of mounts was on either side of the rear part of the bridge. The other pair of mounts was on either side of the space between the funnels. 1 set of reloads was carried for each tube. Propulsion was a repeat of the Miyokos. 12 boilers in 9 rooms. The first 3 rooms, each with 2 boilers, vented to the trunked forward funnels. The rear 6 rooms vented to the rear funnel. These provided steam to the 4 turbines, which generated 130,000 horsepower. Each of these in turn drove one of the 4 propellers for a top speed of 35 knots. Like most other ships, they had 1 rudder. Protection was similar to the Miyokos but improved a bit. The main belt ran from turret 1 to turret 5 and was 100 millimeters aside the engines, increasing to 127 millimeters maximum aside the turrets. The ends of the armored box were formed by bulkheads 100 millimeters thick. The armored deck was 32 millimeters, increasing to 35 millimeters over the magazines and engine rooms. The upper deck above the armored deck was covered with 25 millimeters of armor, thickening to 40 millimeters over the magazines, engine rooms, and boiler uptakes. This meant essentially the magazine and engines were covered by a combined 75 millimeters. Additionally, bulges were fitted that ran from turret 1 to turret 5. Barbette armor was 75 millimeters and turret armor was 25 millimeters. Conning tower armor was 16 millimeters. Aircraft complement was 3 float planes which could be launched from 2 catapults, 1 on each side of the aircraft handling deck between the rear superstructure and turret 4. Modifications were moderate and eventually divided them into 2 subgroups. In 1936, all 4 had their hulls strengthened. Weak welds were replaced with rivets and ballast was added. Between 1938 and 1939, Atago and Takeo replaced their 4 twin torpedo mounts with 4 quadruple ones for the Type 93 Long Lance. Additionally, they carried reloads for the rear mounts. The 2 catapults were replaced with more powerful ones. Also, larger bulges were fitted to improve stability, deepen the TDS, and restore lost buoyancy. Displacement rose to 12,600 tons and speed fell to 34 knots. In mid-1941, Maya and Chokai had their existing torpedo mounts and reloads modified to fire the Type 93 Long Lance. The catapults were also updated. In late March and April 1942, respectively, Takeo and Atago exchanged their single open-mount 120mm guns for 4 twin 5-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft guns. In July of 1943, Atago and Takeo had Type 21 radar fitted. In November of 1943, Atago and Takeo had Type 22 radar fitted. In August of 1943, Chokai and Maya had Type 21 radar fitted. In December 1943 through April 1944, Maya was converted. Turret 3 and the 120mm guns were removed along with the 4 twin torpedo tubes. 4 quadruple mounts for Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes replaced the old twins. Where Turret 3 had been, a stand was built for more medium anti-aircraft. 6 twin 5-inch 40 caliber open mounts were added, one on either side of the new stand that replaced Turret 3 and one where the 120mm guns had been. Type 22 radar was added. New bulges like those on Atago and Takeo were added. Displacement rose to 12,350 tons and speed fell to 34 knots. In June of 1944, after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Atago and Takeo had Type 13 radar fitted. Chokai had Type 13 and 22 radar fitted. Atago spent the first half of December 1941 supporting the invasion of Malaya, and the second half supporting the invasion of the northern Philippines. In the second half of January 1942, she spent a month supporting the invasion of the East Indies. In late February, she was part of the Western Force, so didn't take part in the Battle of the Java Sea, but did spend about a month helping capture or sinking ships trying to escape Java before returning to Japan in mid-April for refit. With her refit complete in mid-May, she took part in the Battle of Midway as part of the Midway Invasion Force, and as such saw little action before returning to Japan in the middle of the month. In mid-August, she left Japan and headed south, where she covered the carriers at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons before docking at Truk in early September. In mid-September, she headed south and took part in the overnight bombardment of Henderson Field before returning to Truk. In mid-October, she again sailed down the slot and helped bombard Henderson Field. In late October, she took part in the Battle of Santa Cruz. In mid-November, at the Battle of Guadalcanal, she missed the first battle because she was escorting the carrier Junio well to the north. She did, however, take part in the second battle, where she helped damage South Dakota, but in return was damaged by Washington. After the battle, she returned to Truk, then to Japan for repairs, arriving in mid-December. With repairs completed by mid-January 1943, she returned to Truk and provided distant cover for the evacuation of Guadalcanal at the end of the month. In late January through late August, she returned to Japan for a refit and ferried troops back to Truk. In mid-September, she was part of the force that tried to intercept the American carrier force that raided the Gilberts, but was too late, so returned to Truk at the end of the month. In mid-October, she was part of the force that tried to intercept the American carrier force that raided Wake, but again was too late, so returned to Truk at the end of the month. The day after the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, she sailed from Truk to Rabaul to take part in the second attempt to attack the American force that had landed at Bougainville. About noon on the 5th, though, while the fleet was refueling in preparation, it was attacked in port by American carrier aircraft. 3 bombs so near missed Atago that they were essentially torpedo hits. While she wasn't in any danger of sinking, repairs back at Japan lasted the rest of the year. At the beginning of January 1944, she returned to Truk and stayed there until mid-February. In mid-February, with the defense of Truk becoming precarious, along with most other ships, she transferred first to Palau, then to the Philippines, and finally to Singapore, arriving in early April. In June, she took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and while she wasn't damaged herself, she returned with the rest of the fleet to Japan afterwards. In mid-July, again still with the majority of the surface fleet, she returned to the East Indies and prepared for the inevitable fight for the Philippines. On October 22nd, she sailed as the flagship of Center Force. Only a day later, at 5:30 a.m. on October 23, 1944, as Center Force was sailing through the Palawan Pass, she was hit by 4 torpedoes from the U.S. submarine Darter. 20 minutes later, at 5:50 a.m., with flooding totally uncontrollable, she sank bow first. Takeo spent the first half of December 1941 supporting the invasion of Malaya, and the second half supporting the invasion of the northern Philippines. In the second half of January 1942, she spent a month supporting the invasion of the East Indies. In late February, she was part of the Western Force, so didn't take part in the Battle of the Java Sea, but did help capture or sink ships trying to escape Java before returning to Japan in mid-March for refit. With the refit completed in mid-May, she took part in the invasion of the Aleutians simultaneous to the Battle of Midway in June of 1942 before returning to Japan at the end of the month. In mid-August, she left Japan and headed south, where she covered the carriers at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons before docking at Truk in early September. In mid-September, she headed south and took part in the overnight bombardment of Henderson Field before returning to Truk. In mid-October, she again sailed down the slot and helped bombard Henderson Field. In late October, she took part in the Battle of Santa Cruz. In mid-November, at the battles of Guadalcanal, she missed the first battle because she was escorting the carrier Junio well to the north. She did, however, take part in the second battle, where she helped damage South Dakota. After the battle, she returned to Truk, then to Japan for refit at the end of November. With refit completed by mid-December, she returned to Truk and provided distant cover for the evacuation of Guadalcanal at the end of January 1943. In late July through late August, she returned to Japan for a refit and ferried troops back to Truk. In mid-September, she was part of the force that tried to intercept the American carrier force that raided the Gilberts, but was too late, so returned to Truk at the end of the month. In mid-October, she was part of the force that tried to intercept the American carrier force that raided Wake, but again was too late, so returned to Truk at the end of the month. The day after the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, she sailed from Truk to Rabaul to take part in the second attempt to attack the American forces that had landed at Bougainville. About noon on the 5th, though, while the fleet was refueling in preparation, it was attacked in port by American carrier aircraft. During the raid, 2 bombs hit Takeo that caused flooding and damaged her steering gear. Repairs and training back at Japan lasted until mid-February of 1944. In mid-February, with Truk becoming precarious, she transferred first to Palau, then to the Philippines, and finally to Singapore, arriving in early April. In June, she took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and while she wasn't damaged herself, she returned with the rest of the fleet to Japan afterwards. In mid-July, again, still with the majority of the surface fleet, she returned to the East Indies and prepared for the inevitable battle for the Philippines. On October 22nd, she sailed as part of Center Force. Only a day later, at 6:30 a.m. on October 23, 1944, as Center Force was sailing through the Palawan Pass, she was hit by 2 torpedoes from the U.S. submarine Darter, the same sub that an hour before had sunk Atago. The damage was bad. A fire erupted and propulsion was knocked out, leaving her dead in the water. Left behind by the main force, it wasn't until later that evening that she finally got underway and headed back to Singapore, eventually arriving in mid-November. Upon arrival, it was realized that, like Miyoko, she was beyond Singapore's ability to repair, and she was deemed a constructive total loss, disarmed, and re-rated as a stationary floating anti-aircraft battery. On the evening of July 31, 1945, British scuba divers used a midget sub to attach half a dozen limpet mines to her hull that blew a 23 by 10-foot hole in her starboard side, jammed her turrets, and buckled her keel. Post-war, she was towed out into the Malacca Strait and scuttled. Chokai spent December 1941 supporting the invasion of Malaya. In January and most of February 1942, she supported the invasion of the East Indies. On February 22nd, she grounded and had to return to Singapore for repairs that kept her out of the Battle of the Java Sea. With repairs completed in mid-March, she covered the invasion of northern Sumatra. In late March, she covered the invasion of the Andaman Islands. In the first half of April, while the big carriers were raiding Sri Lanka, Chokai was part of the force that was sinking merchant shipping in the northern and central Bay of Bengal. Afterwards, she returned to Japan for a refit that lasted until mid-May. With her refit completed, at the end of May, she sailed to cover the invasion force at the Battle of Midway, returning to Japan afterward. In mid-July, she sailed to Truk as the flagship of the South Seas Force. When the U.S. landed on Guadalcanal in early August, she led the force that nearly annihilated the supporting Allied cruisers at the Battle of Savo Island. Though surprised that the battle was near total, she didn't get away clean. Hits from Quincy and Astoria damaged Turret 1, and repairs at Rabaul lasted until the middle of the month. In late August, simultaneous to the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, she covered a convoy that ran troops down the slot to reinforce Guadalcanal, then returned to Rabaul. In mid-October, she was part of the force that bombarded Henderson Field. In late October, then again in early November, she covered convoys that ran reinforcements to Guadalcanal. In mid-November, she didn't take part in the first or second naval battles of Guadalcanal, but did take part in the bombardment of Henderson Field on the night between the two battles in what I like to call the halftime show. At 10:30 a.m. the next morning, while returning north to Rabaul, her force came under air attack by planes from the island. Two bombs so near missed off her starboard that they acted as near torpedo hits. As a result, 2 boiler rooms were knocked out, cutting her speed, but not mortally threatening her. Repairs at Truk lasted the rest of the month. There, she essentially stayed until mid-February of 1943, when she returned to Japan for refit. With that completed in early April, she escorted a convoy to Saipan, then returned to Truk, arriving in mid-April. From there, she mostly escorted convoys around the northern Solomons until mid-July. Off Kolombangara on July 18th, her group was attacked by aircraft from Henderson Field. A near-miss aft burst seams, and she began taking on water by the stern. You know, I really should start calling them near hits rather than near misses. Anyway, while no danger of sinking, she eventually had to return to Japan for repairs, finally arriving in mid-August. A month later, in mid-September, repairs were finally completed and she again sailed to the Southwest Pacific, arriving near the end of the month. In mid-October, she was part of the force that sailed to intercept the American carriers that were raiding Japanese-occupied islands, but no contact was made, so they returned to Truk. At the start of November, she was part of the force sent from Truk to Rabaul to launch a follow-up attack on American forces that had landed on Bougainville, but on the way to Rabaul was diverted to escort some tankers back to Truk. As a result, she missed being damaged at Rabaul when U.S. carriers raided the port on November 5th. Instead, she spent the later half of November sailing around the Marshalls in response to American invasion of the Gilberts before returning to Truk at the end of the month. She stayed at Truk until February of 1944 when, along with most other surface ships, she transferred first to Palau, then to Singapore, arriving in early April. In June, she took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and while she wasn't damaged herself, she returned with the rest of the fleet to Japan afterwards. In mid-July, still with the majority of the surface fleet, she returned to the East Indies and prepared for the inevitable fight for the Philippines. On October 22nd, she sailed as part of Center Force. Unlike her sisters, she avoided any damage at the Palawan Pass and in the Sibuyan Sea, so sailed with Center Force to the Battle of Samar on the morning of October 25, 1944. At the Battle of Samar, she engaged the escort carriers and their escorts. At 9 a.m., she was hit by a 5-inch shell that detonated her torpedoes, starting a massive fire and crippling her. A few minutes later, an aircraft bomb added to the damage. With her engines and rudder damaged, she slowed first to a crawl, then went dead in the water. Unable to maneuver, as Center Force retreated northward, she was abandoned and scuttled. Maya spent the first 2 months of the war supporting the invasion of the Philippines. In late February, she was part of the Western Force, so didn't take part in the Battle of the Java Sea, but did capture or sink ships trying to escape Java toward Australia till mid-March, when she returned to Japan for a refit. In early June, she escorted the carriers that invaded the Aleutians, then returned to Japan. In mid-August, she sailed south with the carriers and escorted them at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. In mid-October, she took part in the bombardment of Henderson Field. Only a few days later, she escorted the carriers at the Battle of Santa Cruz before returning with them to Truk. In mid-November, she also didn't take part in either of the naval battles of Guadalcanal, but did take part in the bombardment of Henderson Field the night between the two battles. The next morning, as she sailed north toward home at Rabaul, her group was attacked by American aircraft. Though one plane missed her with its bomb, its wing hit her mast, causing it to corkscrew right into Maya's heavy anti-aircraft guns where it exploded. the combination of aircraft fuel and 120mm shells started a raging fire that made her ditch her torpedoes to prevent them from breaking off. Repairs back at Japan lasted until the end of January 1943. Repaired and assigned to the Northern Fleet, on March 26th she took part in the Battle of Komandorsky, where she received light damage that was repaired back in Japan before returning to the Aleutians. With nothing left to defend up there, in early August 1943, she left the Aleutians and returned to Japan for a refit, then, in mid-September, sailed to Truk. Following the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2nd, she was one of the ships that sailed to Rabaul to take a second crack at the American beachhead on Bougainville. As such, she was in port refueling at Rabaul on November 5th when American carrier planes raided the port. A bomb hit started a fire in one of her engine rooms that badly damaged her. Nearly a week later, she hobbled her way back to Japan, arriving in early December for repairs, training, and conversion to an anti-aircraft cruiser. With repairs and conversion complete at the start of April 1944, she ferried troops to the Philippines, then continued on to her new home port at Singapore, where she dropped anchor in early May. In June, she took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where she was lightly damaged, then returned with the fleet to Japan for repairs. With repairs completed in mid-July, she again left Japan for Singapore. On October 22nd, as part of Center Force, she sailed for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. At 5:57 a.m., while passing through the Palawan Pass, she was hit by 4 torpedoes from the U.S. submarine Dace. One hit well forward, one hit aside turret 1, starting a fire, another hit aside a boiler room, cutting power. The fourth hit aside her rear engine room, burning, listing to port, and slowing to a crawl, then to a dead stop. Explosions shuttered her until at 6:05 a.m. she finally rolled over and sank.